Star Wars is a media property I don't even need to bother introducing. Keep it short, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I've watched all the movies multiple times, have sat through a lot of the TV shows, have read Star Wars comic books, graphic novels, played video games, what have you. And while definitely to say Star Wars has had its ups and downs would be a bit of an understatement, but in my eyes, it's still a pretty fun franchise to follow regardless. Though I definitely don't agree with every popular opinion, and today I'm gonna be talking about one of my biggest unpopular opinions with the series. Now, who is considered the worst Star Wars character might be quite different nowadays, considering, well, Disney has gone in a unique direction with it, and not everybody's keen on it. But if you were to ask someone before the Disney buyout and throughout basically the whole prequel era of the franchise, who their least favorite character was, the honor for worst Star Wars character at the time would have easily gone to one Jar Jar Binks. Now, if you remember the prequel trilogy era like I do, Jar Jar was kinda everywhere. Look at all the Phantom Menace merch, like this push thing with Jar Jar I've always found weird. But he was in the Clone Wars pretty heavily, and while the other two prequel movies didn't push him as hard, he was still a big portion of this prequel era. But basically, since Disney's took it over, and while Jar Jar has had minor appearances in Star Wars media, it's almost like they're very afraid to use the guy in anything heavily. So, what caused Jar Jar to be such a hated character? And, better question, why have I never hated the guy? Yeah, in all my life of being a big fan of Star Wars, if you were to ask me, I would tell you I kinda like Jar Jar. Now, I'm not saying he's the best Star Wars character. He's no Clone Wars Darth Maul, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke Skywalker, Anakin/Darth Vader, Emperor, He's not on par with any of those characters at all. But he's not someone I consider the most disgraceful, unredeemable monster ever. Well, we also gotta remember what Jar Jar originates from, the Phantom Menace. Love it, hate it. It's hard to deny, though, that when it first came out, it wasn't the big critical success that George Lucas or anyone really thought it would be. And one of the biggest components of blame was Jar Jar Binks. Well, he isn't the only problem with the movie. Heck, I'd argue he's far from the biggest problem. He was definitely cited as being pretty annoying and generally very unlikable by the general audience who saw the film, and thus they would have to suppress him for the further two movies. But if you look at a lot of Phantom Menace's marketing and promotion, there was so much Jar Jar everywhere. So not only was he a character that people already didn't like, but he was a character that was already being used a lot in merchandise. And though his prominence in the movies was subdued, they'd still use him a lot. Like, he got several episodes in Clone Wars to himself, and he would still be pretty heavy in the merchandise side. And we can't forget his biggest story importance, which is him citing emergency power to Chancellor Palpatine, making Jar Jar technically the most important character in the franchise when you really think about it. But in general, these are all kind of like the major things people didn't like about Jar Jar, was his clumsy annoyingness and his just over-prominence. Lucas clearly loved the character, if you couldn't tell. Though, with Disney's buyout of Lucasfilm and their subsequent ownership of Star Wars, for a while, they rarely, if ever, wanted to acknowledge prequel content. Of course, this ban inevitably got lifted, and now they're more than okay with acknowledging the prequels. But that didn't really change Jar Jar's fate even when they did start doing these. One of the books even stated that Jar Jar just became a street performer after the events of Revenge of the Sith and was mocked and ridiculed yet again. To me, that makes it pretty clear that Disney doesn't value the character. They never put him in projects anymore. They never try to, emphasize him. He's hardly a part of the Star Wars brand at this point. And while you could argue he is or isn't the most hated character, I think it's a good sign that Disney realized he's not really someone they want to put much attention on anymore. And generally, that's a rundown of Jar Jar's history in a nutshell. He was this despised character that was over-prominent, and then as soon as Disney bought the series, he's hardly been involved in it at all. And it's nice to see, at least it seems like the hate for him has subdued a bit, though it's still not uncommon to find Star Wars fans who would call Jar Jar the worst character in the franchise. But then that raises my question. Why don't I dislike Jar Jar? I'm admittedly really nostalgic for the prequels, I will admit. And look, I love the prequels, I really do like them, but I'm not going to deny that they're very flawed movies, and I think there's a lot of justified issues for why people shouldn't like them. Like, I get it if you don't like the prequels. I'm not trying to say that this is a defense on them and that everything George Lucas made was a masterpiece. I don't agree with that. But when it comes to Jar Jar specifically, I've just never been able to muster dislike in the guy. Jar Jar's humor is pretty lowbrow, but then again, so is mine. So a lot of his jokes really work for me. And honestly, I also just find the CGI on the dude really impressive. And I feel like a lot of people forget Jar Jar was one of the first big characters they started doing these kind of effects with. I mean, look at characters like Gollum, Davy Jones, Thanos, who would also have these kind of effects. And sure, it's done better with them, but you can't deny Jar Jar Binks was the character who really started this kind of trend of these CGI characters interacting with real-life people. And a big thing I actually want to point out is how fleshed out Jar Jar is in Phantom Menace. Because when you think about every character in that movie, think about how much you learn about them. In spite of being the main character, we don't really learn much about Anakin, we don't learn much about Obi-Wan, we definitely don't learn much about Darth Maul. But with Jar Jar Binks, we know where he lives, Naboo, we know what kind of personality he has, he's a clumsy oaf. We see him develop into being a bit more, well, not less clumsy, but generally equipped to lead an army. And he even gets into, like, Senate and politics somehow and Attack of the Clones. In general, we learn a lot about Jar Jar Binks in just Phantom Menace. Debatably more than literally other characters in that movie. But I think the biggest highlight of Jar Jar to me, though, would be George's passion for the character. I mean, like I said, we learned so much about Jar Jar in his first movie. And while yes, George definitely toned down the amount of Jar Jar in the following films, he still made Jar Jar the reason Palpatine even got into power. He still gave Jar Jar episodes in Clone Wars. He still was willing to make merchandise of Jar Jar. He still had him as a big part of the franchise. He never removed him. He never tried to pretend he didn't exist. He still clearly liked the character, he clearly was happy with him, and he'd still stick him into Star Wars even if fans didn't like him, even if fans made hate memes about him, even if they made documentaries complaining about the guy. He never gave up on Jar Jar Binks, and it's something I appreciate about the character. Sure, that doesn't make him the best character, but it's something I respect from a stamp of a creator, is that he's so passionate about his guy that he wasn't willing to let go of him. But yeah, that's my video on Jar Jar Binks, one of Star Wars' most hated characters that I really don't think is that bad. But tell me in the comments below, what do you guys think of Jar Jar? Do you love Jar Jar? Do you hate Jar Jar? Are you indifferent to Jar Jar? I'm all ears. Until next time, see you later. Oh, by the way, before I forget, I know people are going to ask, why didn't I bring up the Darth Jar Jar theory? Well, that'll be a video for another day.